This is Neima Novetsky from al-HATORAH.org. This Torahcast will explore Parashat Shekalim, the special parashat read every year before Rosh Chodesh Adar to mark the annual half-shekel contributions to the Mikdash which were given during this season. We will question the nature and purpose of the initial command to donate half shekels, which occurred in the first year of the children of Israel's sojourn in the wilderness, and how it relates to the annual donations ever since. Towards the end of the instructions to build the tabernacle, Hashem commands Moshe, Ki tisa et rosh b'nei Yisrael lifkudehem, v'natnu ish kofer nafsho laHashem bifkorotam, v'lo yiyavehem negev bifkorotam. Ze yitnu kol ha'over al ha'pikudim, machatzit ha'shekel b'shekel ha'kodesh. Moshe is told that when he counts the people, he should do so via redemptive object, lest a plague occur during the counting. Hashem then specifies that each individual give a half shekel of silver, designated to be utilized in service of the tabernacle. V'natata oto al avodat ohel moed. What is the relationship between these two directives, and which is the primary concern? Was there a sudden need for a census, and the Mishkan merely happened to be the beneficiary of this event? Or was the primary objective to ensure full national participation in the Mishkan's capital campaign, and the census was only the means through which this was accomplished? A second question relates not to the purpose of the command, but to its duration. From the verses, it is not clear whether this directive was a one-time command, relevant only in the first year in the wilderness, or whether it applies to all future generations. The language of ki tisa, when you count, might imply that the giving of shekels is necessary whenever one counts, especially if we assume that counting without such shekels might invite a plague. If so, though, we would expect to see such collecting of half shekels during all future censuses, yet they are never again mentioned in connection to any other biblical census. And though some have suggested that the plague which came in the aftermath of David's counting of the nation might have ensued due to his failure to count with half shekels, this is not at all explicit in the text. On the other hand, if the half shekels were needed mainly to ensure that there was enough silver to build the tabernacle, perhaps once the Mishkan was built, no further donations were necessary, and the command was meant only for the generation of the wilderness. Yet, here too, evidence culled from later in Tanakh might imply otherwise. Divrei HaYamim 2, chapter 24, describes how when King Yoash decided to refurbish the Beit HaMikdash, he was upset to find that Matzat Moshe Eved Hashem, the collection of Moshe, the servant of Hashem, was not being gathered from the nation, and he proceeded to ensure that the people donated as necessary. This suggests that it was assumed that the people should have been annually contributing to the Mikdash's upkeep, and that perhaps the directive of our verses was for all generations. Commentators debate the above issues and how to interpret each of the later biblical episodes, reaching different conclusions regarding both whether the focal point of the half shekel obligation is the census or the Mikdash contributions, and whether the directive was a one-time or an ongoing obligation. A first approach, taken by the 19th century Italian commentator Shadal, suggests that the directive was a one-time obligation to donate half shekels as part of the initial national census. Though the money collected was used for the tabernacle, this was not the main objective. According to Shadal, a census was being taken at this juncture because the people had just become a nation, and it was merely coincidental that it coincided with the building of the Mishkan. The counting needed to be accompanied by shekel donations not because of the tabernacle, but because at the time of the Exodus, the children of Israel believed in the concept of an evil eye, an ayin hara, and feared that a direct head count would cause a plague. Shadal claims that although this was an erroneous notion, it had the salutary effect of leading the nation away from excessive hubris and reliance on their own numbers and might. Thus, Hashem did not completely dispel the notion, but instead commanded the people to give a ransom payment, kofer nafsho, which would serve as an atonement, kesef HaKippurim, and thereby allow them to conduct a census without fear of harmful consequences. Since the shekel donations were meant only to allay the people's fears, Shadal maintains that it sufficed to give them merely once. The silver was placed in the tabernacle's foundations so that as long as it existed, their presence dispelled the nation's concerns over the evil eye, such that they no longer felt a need to make redemption payments during subsequent censuses. Indeed, This explains why no mention of such donations is found by any other census. None were necessary. According to Shadal, the donations made for the Mikdash in the time of King Yoash were also unrelated to the command of our verse. They were simply a special command of the king, necessary for his personal renovation of the Mikdash, and not an ongoing annual obligation. And as such, there is no mention there either of half shekel specifically. The reference to the contributions as Mas'at Moshe, though, is somewhat difficult for Shadal's opinion, and it would need to be understood as an imprecise analogy used for rhetorical purposes. According to this approach, the halachic requirement to bring half shekels for the Mikdash's upkeep on an annual basis is of rabbinic origin and not biblically mandated. One might question Shadal's reading on several points, as he himself did when he revisited the topic years later. First, from a textual perspective, the language of ki tisa does not sound like a one-time command, but rather an ongoing obligation that is relevant every time one counts the nation. Second, our verses say nothing about the shekalim serving as silver sockets in the tabernacle's foundation. This is mentioned only in Shemot 38, several chapters later. If the silver's presence was what served to remove the need for further sentences, one would have expected this fact to be mentioned here. Finally, and most fundamentally, one might question Shadal's assumptions about the command's relationship to the fear of the evil eye. Is it possible that Hashem would mandate a law which is predicated only on the erroneous superstitions of the nation? Thus, while Rashi too agrees that the directive relates to the census and the fear of an evil eye, he assumes that this fear is a real one, and thus that the need for a redemptive object while counting is perpetual. The command regarding the half shekel donations, then, is an enduring ordinance relating not just to this census, but to all future ones as well. According to Rashi, the initial census was required at this point in time since many people had just died as a punishment for the sin of the golden calf. This is consistent with Rashi's position that all of Shemot chapters 25 through 31 is not recorded in chronological order, and that the instructions to build the Mishkan were transmitted to Moshe only in the aftermath of the sin of the golden calf. Rashi thus maintains that the primary motivation for the donation of the initial half shekels was the census rather than the collection for the building of the Mishkan, which was merely a way to put the money to good use. Since according to Rashi, the fear that a simple head count without using half shekels might bring on an ayin hara and an accompanying plague is a real concern, and not simply a figment of the people's imagination, both this initial census as well as all future ones demanded that a redemptive object be used. Thus, ki tisa is a long-term command. Hashem directs that whenever you count, you should do so via half shekels. Rashi thus assumes that despite the text's silence, all future censuses were indeed performed in this manner, and when David omitted to do so, plague ensued, just as our verses warn. Rashi would likely explain the donations in the time of Yoash in the same manner as Shadal, and posit like him that the annual requirement to donate half shekels is only rabbinic in origin. Rashi's reading then overlaps with that of Shadal, but might be a bit more textually sound regarding some points. It does, however, require that one believe in the evil eye, and that one posit a chronology in the stories of the book of Shemot. It might be partially this discomfort with the superstitious notion of an evil eye, and dissatisfaction with Shadal's attempt to deal with the issue, that leads other commentators to assume that the shekel contributions were needed not for the census, but simply to financially support the Mishkan. Thus, the 19th century Italian exegete Rav Moshe Ashkenazi, in his commentary The Ho'il Moshe, maintains that our verses constitute a one-time obligation to donate for the construction of the tabernacle, and assumes that the census was only a way of ensuring that sufficient funds were collected. Hashem's words to Moshe, ki tisa, are simply good advice rather than an active command. Since Moshe had wanted to count the nation regardless, Hashem advises that he do so through shekel donations, thereby simultaneously procuring the silver needed for constructing the tabernacle. According to Ho'il Moshe, then, the potential plague mentioned in the verses has nothing to do with the census or the evil eye, which is perhaps non-existent. He posits that it is instead connected to the sin of the golden calf, assuming like Rashi that our verses are achronological and occurred after the sin. As part of the atonement, it was necessary to both build the Mishkan and fund it with these half shekels. If not, more punishment would ensue. It was in this role, then, that the half shekel served as a kofer nefesh, a redemption for the soul. As support for this reading, the Hoel Moshe points to the fact that nowhere after our verses do we see half shekels accompanying a census. In addition, as the Hoel Moshe maintains that the directive to collect half shekels was meant only for the generation of the wilderness and the initial tabernacle building campaign, he would likely suggest that Yoash's similar collection was simply modeled after the Torah's one-time obligation, but not a fulfillment of it. Yoash perhaps refers to these monies as Mas'at Moshe, to give more credence to his request and to link the monies to the original donations to the tabernacle, but not because they were commanded by Moshe. A variation of this opinion, developed by Rav Sadia Gaon, agrees that the focus of the collection was the need to financially support the Mikdash, but suggests that the Torah is speaking of an annual obligation to support Hashem's sanctuary and fund its continued maintenance. According to Rav Sadia, when Hashem tells Moshe to gather the half shekels, v'natata oto al avodat oel moed, this refers not to the initial construction of the Mishkan, but to the general upkeep and ongoing service of the Mikdash, including provisions for the sacrifices and the like. The plague that might ensue is not related to the census or evil eye, but is punishment for laxity in helping to fund the Mikdash. The main support for this reading of the story is, of course, Yoash's collection of monies to refurbish the Mikdash, and his rebuke, Madua lo darashta al Leviim lahavim Yehuda u'Yerushalayim et Masat Moshe. Why have you not required of the Levites to bring in out of Judah and out of Jerusalem the collection of Moshe? According to Rav Sadia, then, the halachic requirement to annually bring half shekels to help support the Mikdash is a Torah-mandated law, not a rabbinic one. It is likely that Rav Sadia's reading is at least partially motivated by a desire to counter the arguments of the Karaites, who claim that there was no such obligation. As such, he goes out of his way to show how this is not simply a rabbinic innovation, but actually obligated by the Torah itself. To summarize, we have seen two contrasting approaches to our commandment. Those who assume that shekel donations are necessary specifically when counting, to either allay fears regarding a potential plague or to really avert such a plague, and those who instead connect the collection to the Mishkan's building or upkeep. Each position further subdivides regarding whether or not this directive is an ongoing obligation. The topic raises questions about superstitious beliefs and whether the evil eye is a real concept or a figment of people's imaginations, and regardless, whether or not such beliefs are harmful or helpful. The annual mitzvah of the half shekel donations, be it of rabbinic or of Torah origin, also highlights the need to support our places of worship. How often do we take our shuls for granted, forgetting how much time and effort must go into their upkeep? For more on this topic, and for other topics related to Parashat Vayakel and Shekalim, please visit al-hatorah.org.